Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Jayashilan. I retired as a professor from the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. I am a teacher of linguistics. The unit we are now going to present is part of the module Advanced Syntax. In the 3 or 4 earlier units in this module, we looked at a major development in linguistic theory called the theory of government and binding, often abbreviated as GB. And you learned a whole lot of things about GB. After GB, the next big advance in theoretical linguistics is represented by the theory of minimalism. The theory of minimalism was presented by Noam Chomsky in a paper that came out in 1992 called A Minimalist Program for Linguistic Theory. We'll look at some basic facts of minimalism in this unit, then develop them further in later units. As the name minimalism suggests, it's an attempt to make linguistic theory minimal, exceedingly simple. As you will recall, even GB was a great simplification of grammar. It got rid of rules of grammar, it got rid of phrase structure rules, and it was an extremely lean and spare theory. Then why does linguistic theory require an even more minimalist version of linguistic theory? You will recall that GB had as its substance, besides the more theoretical claims, it had as its substance a certain modules of principles, UG principles of universal grammar. Now, in formulating those rules and in subsequent discussions, the fact that we are trying to relate these principles to the language faculty was perhaps slightly forgotten. What minimalism does is to put two very stringent conditions on the principles of UG. What it says is, for a principle to count as a principle of UG, it has to minimally meet 2 requirements. Each of these principles must be derived from 1, the legibility conditions imposed on derivations by outside systems that interface with language, and 2, the economic conditions of the computational system. Let me explain this a little more. What are the outside systems that interface with language? As you know, language relates sound and meaning. And we know that in GB, the sound representation of an utterance, we call it PF, phonological form or phonetic form, and the meaning representation of an utterance is called LF or logical form. And we know that syntax maps a derivation to these two levels of representation. Now these two levels of representation are interfaces with systems that are outside the language faculty proper. Let me explain how. For example, the phonetic form or phonological form PF, it is a string of sounds. Minimalism is sort of keeping it very simple. It's a string of sounds. Now these sounds have to be now produced by the articulatory system or the human body. For example, the sounds have to be articulated by the tongue, the lips, the larynx, etc. These are not part of the language system. These were actually preempted by language, although they were primarily meant for other uses. For example, the tongue is meant for eating. It is not meant for uttering language. So these are outside systems that the language is borrowed and made use of. The language faculty is borrowed and made use of to make its sound representation audible. Similarly, take the LF, the logical form. The logical form in itself is too abstract a representation to be immediately translated into meaning. The LF representation has to be interpreted by outside systems like memory. For example, I saw him. The reference of I and the reference of him have to be interpreted by pragmatics with the aid of memory to refer to particular individuals in the outside world. I is the speaker utterance, him is some entity which is third person masculine, singular, and which particular entity the pragmatics of the situation has to tell you. So the two interfaces PF and LF have to interact with outside systems, the systems which are outside language. Now what Chomsky said was that these outside systems impose certain legibility conditions on representations, on these representations. For example, the articulatory system tells the phonological form, look, you cannot have a sound which requires the tongue to be both high and low in the mouth at the same instant. It is impossible, it is contradictory. So there are conditions imposed by the articulatory system on the possible forms of linguistic sounds. Similarly, the logical form, if it has an unbound variable, okay, an unbound variable cannot be interpreted. It has to be interpreted by an operator, okay, and it has to be interpreted, and then references have to be determined by the outside systems of the mind. Okay. Now that again, the outside systems tell logical form, if you have an unbound variable in your representation, we cannot interpret it. So these are legibility conditions imposed by the outside systems on the two interfaces PF and LF. And the strict condition which Chomsky required UG principles to obey, the conditions are that these principles should be such as to be explained by the legibility conditions imposed by the outside systems. The second thing that Chomsky required of UG principles was that if it is not explained, if a certain UG principle is not explained in terms of legibility conditions, then it should be explainable in terms of the economic conditions of the computational system. As you know, the derivation of sentence involves a mental computation, and the mental computation obeys certain computational principles which are not particular to language. For example, a shorter in wiring, a shorter wire is more economical than a longer wire. That is, if you have to go a shorter distance, that is more economical than going a longer distance. Thus, for example, the linguistic principle that movements should go in minimal steps, small steps, successive cyclically. That is dictated by the need to keep each step short, and that is a computational requirement. So each UG principle has to be explained in terms of either the legibility conditions or the economic conditions. These are general principles of minimalism, which sort of impose a kind of desideratum on the type of principle that can count as a UG principle. The minimalist theory also made certain more substantive changes. For example, one thing which you immediately notice is that a derivation is now built up from the bottom of the tree upwards. That is, you first build the most deeply embedded phrase, and then the next higher, and so on. This idea of building up the tree from the bottom is not new, is not entirely original to linguistics, generative linguistics. There are other types of grammars which used it earlier. For example, tree adjoining grammars. Maybe Chomskyan theory borrowed this idea from tree adjoining grammars. Also, this was used by Montague grammar even earlier. So now notice that, remember that trees are built up from the bottom upwards. This is very different from the GB tree or traditional grammar tree, which started with an entire big PS tree, starting with S goes to NP, inflection, then it goes to VP, tense goes to VP, etc. The whole thing is given at one block. So if you first build up the tree from the as a whole, and then you do transformations. Here you start building up the tree from the bottom. And importantly, what this facilitates is that take a certain movement. The movement starts from a certain position and it has a target position. The claim now is that as soon as the target position has been merged with the tree, the movement takes place. That is, movements don't wait till the whole sentence has been built up. And an element can move as soon as the target of its movement has been merged. How does the derivation now look like? You go to the lexicon, take lexical items and put them together, and this putting together operation is called merge. Merge. Now, one stricture which minimalism insists on is that each merge operation puts together only two elements. That is, every merge operation is binary, which has as a consequence which has this consequence that syntactic trees are now binary branch. If it branches at all, it branches only in two ways. If you will remember, this did not used to be the case in earlier versions of generative theory. For example, take a verb phrase with a verb like give. Give the book to Mary. Okay? And in the old textbooks you will see, you get a VP with a V, give, and the book, and to Mary, all give, the book, and to Mary are all sisters. This is no longer possible because that is a ternary branching tree. This has to be reanalyzed. We won't go into how the analysis is done because that's another question. Now, I said that a movement takes place as soon as its target is merged. For example, a verb may go and adjoin to an affix as soon as the affix morpheme is merged. Similarly, the subject will go and adjoins to tense as soon as into the spec position, not adjoin, into the spec position of TP as soon as the tense head is merged. Okay? Now this means that the tree is changing as the derivation is being built up. And this has a very interesting consequence for the general shape of grammars. A very important consequence is that there is no longer anything like deep structure or destructure in the theory. Why is that? Think about it. What was a deep structure in early transformational grammar or destructure in GB? It was a representation of a sentence prior to any transformation. Before any transformation moves things around, this was the shape of the tree. It was the kind of original shape of the tree before any transformation was implemented. Now, the whole sentence starts in this pristine form before any transformation, and then you do transformations on this entire tree. That is no longer possible now. You start building the tree from the bottom up. As soon as the target of a movement has been merged, the movement takes place, so the tree has changed. So there is no point in the derivation where the entire sentence is present in its pre-movement form, pre-transformational form. So there cannot be a deep structure or destructure in minimalism. Another thing, you see this decision to build the tree from the bottom upwards by the merge operation has these very interesting consequences. One is that movements take place as soon as the condition is right. You don't wait for the tree to be completely built up. Another thing which Chomsky suggested is that when you merge something to the tree, say a new lexical item, or move something to the tree from, say, the direct object of the passive sentence is moved to the subject position. So you can build up the tree either by merging lexical items from the lexicon or moving things from within the tree. Either movement or merge, Chomsky now insists, can take place only at the top of the tree. That is, if you want to merge something, you can merge it only at the top. You cannot go and merge it in the middle of the tree. Similarly, if you want to move something, you can move it only to the top of the tree. You cannot merge it into a medial position. This is called the extension condition. The extension condition. It says that every merge of move must extend the tree upwards. This has a very interesting consequence, because what it says is that when you have built up a tree up to a certain point, you cannot introduce a new element into the middle of it, or move something from within it into a middle position. The part which is built up, you cannot mess around with. That is undisturbed. This is a great economy for the memory of the derivation, because otherwise it's very difficult for the memory to manipulate a tree in which things are moving around in the middle or being merged in the middle. Here, extension condition says that a thing can be merged only at the top of the tree, a thing can be moved only to the top of the tree. The part which has been already built up is left undisturbed. What are the consequences of the extension condition? One, of course, is that it minimizes the effort of the computational system. That is what I just said. It also has certain syntactic consequences. If you remember earlier transformation grammar, we had something called the cyclic application of transformations. The cyclic application of transformations. It went as follows. Each clause was considered a cycle. And when a transformation has to apply, you have to start with the most deeply embedded clause, do all the transformations in it, and only then go on to the next higher cycle and the next higher cycle. Okay? If, for example, there is a sentence with two embedded clauses, one embedded clause and another embedded clause within the embedded clause, then you start all the transformations with the most deeply embedded clause. Then you do the transformations in the next higher embedded clause, and then you do the transformations in the matrix clause. That is the cyclic application of transformations. Now, the cyclic application of transformations simply follows from the extension condition. Cyclic application of transformations is a corollary of the extension condition. How do we get that? Let us see. Take a sentence with one embedded clause. That embedded clause is non-finite. The matrix clause has the verb seems with an empty subject position. Its embedded clause has an empty subject position, and you have a passive verb, to have been killed, John. Okay? Now John has to ultimately move to the subject position of the matrix clause. But it has to do it in two movements. It has to first move from the object position of killed to the embedded subject position, which is empty, and then move again to the matrix subject position. Suppose perversely we decided that this NP will not move into the embedded subject position. It will wait. This NP John will wait until the matrix clause has been built up, and you move it in one fell swoop all the way to the matrix subject position. So you will get John seems empty subject position to have been killed. John seems empty subject position to have been killed. Now the empty subject position has to be filled. Suppose you decide to fill it with a dummy it. That's a meaningless it, and it seems, etc. Okay? That is a dummy it. So suppose you fill the empty subject position in the embedded clause with it, then you will get this bizarre sentence, John seems it to have been killed. Now this kind of derivation is blocked by the extension condition, because what you are doing is you're first moving this NP John from the embedded object position all the way to the matrix subject position, and then you are going back into the middle of the tree and introducing the dummy it into the middle of the tree, which is disallowed by the extension condition.
Yes.
What we did in this unit was to introduce you to the bare outlines of minimalist theory. Minimalist theory, I told you, is the next big development in linguistic theory after GB. And we said that it required every UG principle to be justified in terms of one of two things. Either it has to be justified as following from a legibility condition imposed on the interfaces by the outside systems, or as due to an economy condition of the computation. That's what we said first. Then we told you, we learned about the way a tree is built up now. A tree is built up from the bottom of the tree upwards. And the transformations take place, movements take place as soon as the target of a movement has been merged. And thirdly, we looked at the extension condition and the consequence of the extension condition, namely that the cyclic application of transformations is a corollary of the extension condition. Thank you.